Hello, my name is Morgan Hayes, and for most of my life, I've been told, by my father, no less, that I didn't belong. Not in his world, not in the Navy circles he ruled, and certainly not on a SEAL training ground. I learned to swallow those words, to keep my head down, and let people believe what they wanted. But that day, as his voice echoed with those same cutting words, another voice rose behind me, a colonel's, calling me by a name no one here was supposed to know, Madam Falcon? That was the moment everything changed. The ocean breeze carried a crisp November chill as Morgan R. Hayes stepped toward the SEAL training ground gate, just in time to hear her father's voice cut the air. You don't belong here. She didn't pause. The walkway stretched ahead in straight lines, edged with rows of American flags snapping in the wind, their fabric catching sunlight between the shadows of swaying palms. Somewhere beyond the bleachers, a brass band was warming up, the uneven scales carried on the salty air. Overhead, gulls wheeled lazily, their cries falling into the rhythm of the morning. Morgan adjusted the brim of her baseball cap, the bill low enough to shade her eyes, and joined the short line at the security checkpoint. The guard barely glanced at her windbreaker and jeans before giving a polite nod and waving her through. She smiled in return, stepping aside when a man with a weathered canvas tote struggled to balance it on his shoulder. He was older, 70s. Maybe, his ball cap embroidered with the emblem of a long-retired Navy ship. Morning, she said, steadying the tote before it could slip. Thanks, ma'am, he replied, shifting his weight with a grateful sigh. Reserved seats are over. By the shade side, she told him, pointing toward the far section. Once the sun comes up, that glare off the bay will blind you. He chuckled, a dry sound carried on the wind. Good to know. First time my grandson's marching. Then you'll want a clear view, she said, walking him a few steps toward the posted seating chart. When a young volunteer in a too-big polo shirt appeared, Morgan passed the veteran off with a nod and a quiet, make sure he gets there okay. As she turned back toward the gate, a familiar timbre reached her ears. Admiral Thomas Hayes, her father, was greeting a cluster of fellow officers with the easy formality of a man who lived in starched uniforms and structured conversations. His jacket bore the weight of decades of service, every ribbon and pin perfectly aligned. He turned just enough to let his gaze sweep over her, the corner of his mouth tightening as if he'd spotted a misplaced tool on a ship's deck. Trainees loitering nearby followed his eyes. One of them smirked at her lack of insignia, another muttered something low enough to draw a chuckle from his buddy. Morgan kept her focus on the sound of the brass warming into a march, letting the sting roll off her like rain on a slicker to movement. Caught her attention. Near the back row of seats, a man in army dress blue scanned the crowd. The silver in his hair matched the polished tip of the cane in his left hand. His eyes, sharp despite the lines at their corners, found hers, and stopped. Colonel Rob Dalton's expression shifted in a way that drew the air taut. He stepped forward with deliberate care, his cane tapping against the pavement. The space between them seemed to narrow, though neither spoke at first. Ma'am, he said, voice low but certain. Then, softer, as though the word had been kept. Under lock for years, Madam Falcon? The murmur began at the edge of the group, trainees glancing at one another, whispers curling like smoke. Even the brass faltered for a beat before resuming. Admiral Hayes had turned, his eyes narrowing just slightly at the title. Dalton stopped in front of her, the grip on his cane firm, his gaze unwavering. Morgan met it without flinching, her voice steady, even warm in a way that carried no apology. It's been a long time, sir. His hand tightened on the cane. The word Falcon lingered in Morgan's thoughts as she sat in her small marina apartment, the night wind rattling the blinds. She had drawn the curtains halfway, letting just enough of the harbor lights seep into the room to mingle with the amber glow of the desk lamp. Outside, the masts in the marina swayed gently, and the halyards tapped against them with a soft, metallic clink, an old sailor's lullaby she had known since childhood. She poured hot water over a tea bag, the steam curling upward, carrying the faint scent of chamomile. As she set the mug on the worn oak coffee table, the radio on the counter began playing America the Beautiful. The opening notes seemed to fold time back on itself, drawing her into a memory so vivid it felt as though her mother were still there, standing in their small kitchen, humming the same tune while stirring a pot of chicken soup. Her mother had been the only one in the family who believed in her without condition. She'd been the one to frame Morgan's first sailing certificate in a cheap wooden frame and place it in the living room for guests to see. When her mother passed away, the frame had been quietly moved to a hallway shelf, and soon after, tucked into a box in the garage. Morgan stared into the tea, watching the color deepen. She thought of all the times she'd outperformed her peers. In school, science fairs, swim meets, the regional debate competition, only to have her achievements met with a dismissive nod from her father. Her younger brother Luke's smallest accomplishments, in contrast, were celebrated with steak dinners and champagne toasts. The flash of memory shifted, pulling her into the brutal pace of her early military years. long runs at dawn, push-ups. In the grit and wind, blistered hands from rope climbs that tore at her skin. She had passed every qualification with time to spare. On missions, she had volunteered for the work that no one else wanted, the overnight watches, the supply drops. Into remote terrain, the first into the water when a landing site was under threat. She remembered the feel of the jungle air the day she found Daniel Cross, his leg pinned under a fallen branch, his face pale from blood loss. She'd cut him free, carrying him half a mile uphill to the evac site, the whole time urging him to keep his eyes open. She remembered Sarah Whitman's terrified eyes when the building began to crumble in Kandahar. The dust, the deafening crack of concrete splitting, the burst of adrenaline as Morgan pulled her clear just before the final collapse, and Rob Dalton, his body shielded behind hers while rounds tore into the dirt around them. She could still hear the grunt of pain when he was hit, still feel the strain in her muscles as she hauled him toward cover. Her gaze fell to a small stack of keepsakes on the side table. A holiday card from a village child in the Philippines, smudged handwriting. And a drawing of a soldier handing over bread. A black and white photo of her mother, smiling in the wind with a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. Beneath them, an envelope. She pulled it open, careful not to crease the edges more than they already were. Inside was the letter, printed on official Navy letterhead, that confirmed what she'd known but hadn't wanted to face. The Medal of Honor nomination for her actions in Afghanistan had been denied. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Admiral Thomas Hayes. The paper felt heavier than any medal she'd ever been given. It was not just the denial, it was the deliberate erasure, the official confirmation that her father had the final say in whether her service was acknowledged. And he had chosen silence. She set the letter down slowly, her fingers resting on it for a long moment before pulling away. The tea had gone cold. From the desk in the corner, her secure laptop chimed. A soft, singular ping. She turned her head toward it, her heartbeat picking up. The screen showed an incoming encrypted message. The sender's name blinked in the corner, Major Daniel Cross. If you're ready to fight this, I'm in, Daniel said, his voice steady over the encrypted line. 4 days later, Morgan spotted him through the cafe's wide front window. The place was small and inviting, a corner spot just off Orange Avenue with the smell of cinnamon rolls drifting out to the sidewalk. Sunlight streamed through glass panes, catching on the warm wood tables and the gleam of polished brass fixtures. Inside, the owners, a retired Marine named Chuck and his wife, Linda, a nurse, moved with practiced ease. Chuck poured coffee for 2 older vets hunched over the morning paper, while Linda worked behind the counter, sliding trays of pastries into the glass case. Daniel stood as Morgan walked in, his frame filling the booth's narrow space. He had a cup of coffee already waiting for her, the steam curling lazily above it. On the house, he said with a grin, nodding toward the counter. They still remember you helping that Marine with his VA mess last year. Morgan slid into the seat, curling her hands around the mug. That was nothing. Not to him. Daniel replied. The bell over the door jingled again, and Sarah Whitman stepped inside, the cool November air trailing behind her. She scanned the cafe, spotted them, and approached with an expression that mixed nerves and resolve. She wore a simple sweater, jeans, and her hair pulled back, a faint tension in her jaw. Sorry, I'm late, Sarah said, sliding into the booth beside Daniel. Traffic was a nightmare. Morgan shook her head. We're just getting started. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside were mission records, after-action reports, and sworn testimonies, each page a piece of a puzzle her father had tried to bury. Sarah glanced at the top sheet and exhaled sharply. I haven't seen some of these in years. Her voice dropped. You know they scrubbed my name off that Kandahar rescue report, too? Daniel's eyes narrowed. This isn't just about one medal. This is a pattern. They leaned closer, the low hum of the cafe wrapping around their conversation. Morgan laid out the timeline, key dates, cross-referenced with testimonies from people they trusted. She spoke evenly, but her tone carried the weight of years spent holding these facts in silence. Here's the reality, Daniel said. If we push this, it's going to get ugly. They'll come for our careers, drag our names through the mud, maybe even try to discredit the rescues. Sarah nodded. I've seen it happen. But I can't keep pretending it's fine. Morgan's gaze moved between them. Truth over silence. That's the only way I know how to live. For a moment, the conversation paused as Linda stopped by with a plate of cinnamon rolls, setting it down with a smile. Fuel for your meeting, she said, her tone warm but knowing. Chuck gave them a quick nod from across the room, as if to say we've got your back. Daniel took a bite, then leaned forward, his voice dropping. If Dalton saw you at the gate, word's going to spread. Morgan didn't flinch. Her hand rested lightly on the folder, the sunlight catching the faint scar across her knuckles. Her voice was calm but carried an unshakable edge. Then, it's time the right people hear my name. A cold November wind swept through Arlington National Cemetery as Morgan stepped onto the platform, the rows of white headstones stretching endlessly behind her. The air carried that quiet weight only. This place could hold, crisp, still, and respectful. Even the trees, their branches bare against the gray sky, seemed to stand at attention. The memorial amphitheater was filled. Families clutched folded programs, their gloved hands occasionally brushing away the chill. Veterans in dress uniforms stood alongside Gold Star families, dignitaries, and a scattering of journalists with cameras hanging at their sides. The faint scent of wreaths and polished brass mingled with the cold, and from somewhere behind the amphitheater, a bugler tested a few notes of taps. Morgan took her seat in the second row, behind the section reserved for senior officers. Daniel and Sarah sat nearby, their eyes scanning the crowd. Colonel Dalton was 2 seats over, his cane resting against his knee. Her father stood at the edge of the platform, exchanging handshakes with dignitaries as if the entire day were his stage. The ceremony began with the national anthem. Men removed their hats, women placed their hands over their hearts, and a hush fell over the crowd. The sound of the anthem echoed through the stone arches, the final note hanging in the air before the chaplain offered the invocation. A Marine Corps color guard presented the flags. The first speaker, a retired general, spoke about the generations who had stood in harm's way. His voice carried both pride and sorrow. Then came her father's turn. Admiral Thomas Hayes moved to the podium with the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding a room. Today, he began, his voice projecting across the amphitheater, we honor those who have served with valor, courage, and devotion to this nation. Among us are heroes, men and women whose actions speak louder than any medal could. He proceeded to name a list of distinguished service members present: Colonel Robert Dalton, Major Daniel Cross, Lieutenant Sarah Whitman, but not her. Morgan's name never crossed his lips. The omission wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate. And she felt the familiar sting settle low in her chest. Colonel Dalton's head turned sharply. His voice cut through the crisp air before her father could continue. One name you've missed, Falcon. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd. Several journalists straightened, pens poised. Morgan saw her father's jaw tighten, the muscles working under the skin. Dalton leaned toward the microphone, his voice steady but carrying weight. You know her as Morgan Hayes? I know her as the officer who saved my life under fire. All eyes shifted toward her. Dalton stepped back from the podium and gestured toward her. Colonel Hayes, would you join us? Morgan rose slowly. Each step to the platform seemed to carry more than the weight of her boots. It carried years of silence, of battles fought in shadows, of service unacknowledged. The cold air bit at her cheeks as she reached the podium. Thank you, Colonel Dalton, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. She looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some recognizing her now, others still unsure. I stand here not for recognition, but to honor those I had the privilege to serve alongside. Men and women whose bravery often came without applause, whose sacrifices will never fit neatly into a speech. She spoke of missions where teamwork mattered more than rank, of watching young service members grow into leaders, and of the quiet heroism in moments no one would ever photograph. She didn't call out her father or anyone else. She didn't need to. Her words carried their weight. When she stepped back from the podium, the applause started slowly, then swelled until it filled the amphitheater. Dalton rose to his feet, bringing his hand to his brow in a crisp salute. Others followed, senior officers, enlisted veterans, even civilians who knew enough to recognize the gesture's gravity. Morgan returned the salute with quiet precision. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw her father still seated, his face unreadable. Then, just as she began to step away, a voice rang out from the press section. Colonel Hayes, can we talk about your Medal of Honor nomination? Cameras flashed in rapid bursts, catching her mid-step as the question hung in the cold November air.by Friday morning. Morgan's name was on every veteran news blog, and in the local paper's Thanksgiving edition. The headlines varied, some focused on the Arlington ceremony, others on Colonel Robert Dalton's salute, but all carried her name in bold print. She had managed to stay off the public radar for years. Now, there was no going back. The small-town diner on Main Street in coastal Virginia was the kind of place where the coffee was strong, the booths had deep grooves from decades of use, and the locals all knew the waitstaff by first name. The scent of frying bacon and fresh biscuits drifted through the air, mixing with the hiss of the griddle and the low hum of conversation. A waitress in a cranberry red sweater moved between tables, topping off mugs without asking, her nails painted with tiny turkeys for the holiday weekend. Morgan slid into a booth near the window, pulling off her jacket. Outside, the breeze off the bay rattled the diner's old storm door, and a paper turkey decoration flapped lazily against the glass. Daniel was already seated across from her, a steaming plate of scrambled eggs and hash browns in front of him. He slid a folded copy of the local paper across the table. "Your front page," he said, his voice low but tinged with pride. "And not in the mystery woman at the ceremony way. They used your rank." She glanced at the photo, a still frame from Arlington, her hand raised in salute. Below it, the caption read, "Colonel Morgan R. Hayes receives a standing salute." On Thanksgiving morning, before she could respond, an elderly couple at the next booth turned toward her. The woman, her white hair pinned neatly back, reached across to touch Morgan's hand. "Thank you for your service, dear. My brother served in Vietnam. He would have been proud to see what you did up there." Morgan gave a warm smile. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." Daniel sipped his coffee. "You should see the chatter online. Veterans are sharing your photo, telling stories. Some even remember missions you led." But, he hesitated. "There's pushback, too. Anonymous posts saying you're making it about yourself, questioning why the Navy never put you in the spotlight before." She sighed, not surprised. The truth's never as clean as the headlines. The bell over the diner's front door jingled, and in walked Rachel McKee, a young reporter from the local paper. She spotted them immediately, waved politely at Daniel, and approached with a small notepad in hand. "Colonel Hayes? I'm Rachel. I'd like to request an in-depth interview for our Sunday edition. I think people should hear more about your missions, the people you served with, what you've done for veterans since." Morgan hesitated, weighing the offer. "I'll talk," she said finally, "but the focus stays on the work. Not my family, not the politics. The men and women I served with, that's the story." Rachel nodded eagerly. "Understood." She slid a business card across the table. "I'll call to set up a time." When the reporter left, Daniel leaned in. "Speaking of politics, Admiral Hayes requested a closed-door meeting. Official Navy channels." Morgan's fork was still halfway to her mouth. "Of course he did." The waitress appeared then, setting down the check and, without a word, a folded piece of paper. "Guy at the counter asked me to give you this," she said. Morgan unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was unmistakable, her father's. "We need to talk." "Dad." She read it twice, folded it back with deliberate care, and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Looking out the window at the gray bay beyond, she said quietly, "Tomorrow." The Hayes family's grand Thanksgiving table would be set with crystal goblets, polished silver, and a roast turkey the size of a small boat. But in Morgan's small apartment kitchen, there were only two simple place settings: a pair of white plates with faint blue rims, cloth napkins folded neatly beside them. The oven light glowed warmly against the roasting turkey breast inside, and the tart sweet scent of cranberry sauce cooling on the counter mingled with the faint aroma of cinnamon from the mulled cider simmering on the stove. Soft jazz drifted from the old radio on the windowsill, the trumpet notes curling gently through the air. She had turned down the formal Hayes dinner without hesitation. This year, she didn't feel like sitting through polite small talk, pretending her place at the table had ever been more than symbolic. Instead, she had chosen to spend the evening with the people who had stood beside her when it mattered most. A knock at the door broke the stillness. Daniel stepped in, the November chill clinging to his coat, a pie tin in one hand. "Pumpkin," he said, grinning. "From my mom?" she insisted. Sarah arrived moments later, her cheeks pink from the cold, holding a paper bag from the local bakery. "Fresh sourdough," she said, unwrapping it on the counter. "Still warm." They moved easily around her small kitchen, Daniel uncorking cider, Sarah slicing bread, Morgan pulling the turkey from the oven. Conversation flowed in fits and starts, drifting from the light-hearted, "Remember that time the tent collapsed on Cross in Kandahar," to the serious, "We lost a lot of good people, but we saved more than we lost." The laughter was unforced, the silences comfortable. Partway through, Morgan's phone buzzed on the counter. She put it on speaker, and Dalton's voice filled the room, low, steady, and tinged with warmth. "Falcon, you've done more good than you know. And now they all know it, too. Be proud, Colonel." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Morgan poured 3 mugs of steaming cider and lifted hers. "To truth," she said, her gaze moving between them and to those who stand by it. They clinked their mugs together, and laughter soon filled the little apartment, spilling into the hall like light through an open doorway. From her spot in the corner, Rachel McKee, invited as a friend, not just a reporter, snapped a photo. It caught Morgan mid-laugh, Daniel leaning back in his chair, Sarah reaching for another slice of bread. The warmth of the oven light glowed behind them, and the steam from the cider curled like a soft veil above the table. It would be the closing image of Rachel's Sunday feature, a snapshot not of rank or ceremony, but of chosen family and quiet joy. On a quiet Thanksgiving night, the warmth in that little kitchen spoke louder than any grand speech ever could. Morgan's journey was not about reclaiming a seat at a table, but about recognizing her place in the hearts of those who truly saw her worth. In life, kindness has a way of circling back to us, and understanding blooms when we choose to look beyond appearances. Like a lamp glowing in a window on a dark street, even the smallest act of compassion can guide someone home. Perhaps today is the perfect time to pass a little of that light on to someone who needs it, and so, that moment on the SEAL training ground became more than just a turning point. It was proof that worth isn't decided by bloodlines or doubt, but by courage, perseverance, and quiet strength. We all face voices that try to define us, but the choice to rise above them is ours alone. What about you? What lesson stands out most from this story, and what is one thing you'll carry into your own life from today onward? If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.